Welcome back to the Oscar Project Podcast, the show where I discuss Oscar-nominated films year by year. I am your host, Jonathan Eacherberg, and today I am bringing you an interview with Kirsten Slemint, director of the short film Burnt Country, which was selected as a finalist for the 2024 Student Academy Awards. Before I jump into the interview, please be sure to subscribe to the show in your podcast player so you can get all the newest episodes as soon as they are released. If you like the interview and want to hear more, please consider leaving a rating and review in Apple Podcasts or Spotify. Kirsten Slemint is a science communicator and award-winning filmmaker whose work explores the intersection between people and nature and is driven by an interest in social impact. Her first short film, Hamidbar, explored the deserts of Israel, and she joins me on the podcast to talk about her most recent short film, Burnt Country, which was selected as a finalist in the documentary category of the 2024 Student Academy Awards. Kirsten, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me.
So your film focuses on the dangers of wildfire in Australia and how the Indigenous cultural burning is working to protect the Australian wilderness. How did you learn about this story and what drew you to want to make a film about it?
Yeah, for sure. So the idea for Burnt Country has actually been years in the making, actually. I'm a scientist, and throughout my studies, I found a really confusing lack of Indigenous representation and knowledge. Indigenous Australians are the oldest living culture in the world. They've been caring for this country for well over 60,000 years. And as Hugh says in the film, it's one of the cultures that humanity has to learn from if we're going to stabilize the planet. So I think it's really in that where the film was born, which was many years ago. And this intersection between Western and Indigenous knowledge is, I think, something incredibly rich and really worthy of our time. So it's sort of within there that this film was born.
Sure, that makes sense. Now, one of the most striking themes in the film that I noticed was the way you juxtapose fire with water. I think there's even a few shots where you have a jump cut right from one to the other. What brought you to the idea of marrying those two elements together on screen for the film?
Yeah, first I want to shout out my editor, Piotr. He was not only a dream to work with, but jumped right into this film alongside with me. And I think these sorts of juxtapositions and the ideas that we played with, it's got his fingerprint all over it. So I'm really, really grateful for that. I think fire and water, it'd be wrong for it not to occur.
Right, yeah.
Right? And so, but I think these editorial decisions, it was our attempts to challenge some of the audience's perceptions. So that contrast of fire and water is definitely one that we wanted to sort of challenge. And it's something Piotr raised early on. Australia is an island, obviously.
Right, yep.
And it's got numerous rivers and waterfalls. So I think the perception is that Australia has an abundant access to water. And I don't think people are consciously thinking, you have all this water, just put out the fires. But there's a real irony in it that we do have such incredibly bad wildfires and droughts that cause them and all these kinds of things. And so I think that contrast was something we really wanted to push and explore. Sure. And just have people have a question mark over those things for themselves, ask some more questions, look a little bit deeper. The other thing is that I think there is this stereotype, water overpowers fire, right? But that's not the solution to these wildfires. These low frequency cultural burns, this is really the solution that we need. And also the bringing together of Western and Indigenous knowledge. It's not about one or the other. It's about a future that looks to combine these knowledges and where our communities can come together.
Absolutely. I think that's really important what you said there at the end. And you have some shots both at the beginning and at the end of the film showing one of your collaborators, James Shaw, who is an Indigenous fire practitioner. He's conducting these controlled cultural burns. And just technically, it looks like you were shooting these pretty close up. What sort of dangers and challenges did you face filming around all of this fire for the film?
Yeah, good pickup. You're the first person to ask me, but I spoke about these dangers or challenges in an interview with the British cinematographer. It's a really important question about how we're keeping ourselves safe. So thank you for asking that. I think a lot of the work we do in wildlife can be in quite dangerous situations or extreme conditions. And a lot of the work I do is solo. So managing that risk is really important. Certainly, though, I am playing with, fire in a real sense, we need to keep ourselves safe, our equipment, these sorts of things. So our production manager for Burnt Country, she actually left really early on. So unfortunately, it was up to me to organize everything from the production schedule to the budget, and of course, risk assessment and management. So it was really tough actually wearing so many different hats, being in the field as the cinematographer, the director, and the production manager stood amongst that fire. It was really challenging, but it wasn't entirely unfamiliar to me. I was the production manager on my first film, which you mentioned earlier, Kimmerer, which is a natural history piece in the desert of Israel. So in that film, I was hiking a couple of kilometers into national parks there, often alone, in desperate heat, with about 30 kilos of camera equipment on my back.
Right, yeah.
So, it sounds like a lot, solo filming in deserts, surrounded by fire, but behind the scenes, we put all kinds of safety measures in place. For each of these productions, I had local and international contacts, multi-step check-in procedures, and I worked a lot with the national park staff so that people knew where I was, they knew where I was going, they knew what I was doing. You name it, that sort of stuff is what keeps us safe.
Sure.
and why we can do things like that. I've worked hard to upskill myself in other areas. So I'm a qualified senior first aid officer. I also have a lot of experience in rural and remote areas. I think something I find interesting that I bring to this as well is that as a scientist, I take a lot of care to study things like animal behavior or, identifying the flora and fauna of a place. And that supports me so much in the field as well. So, yeah. And obviously you can hear from my accent, I am Australian.
Yes. One of my favorite accents in the world, if I may say so.
Oh, wow. Thank you so much. In many, many ways, I felt so at home in the shoot for Burnt Country.
Yeah, for sure. And it comes through in the images, and you really do have some incredible images throughout the film, whether it's the somewhat disturbing images of wildlife struggling amidst the raging fires, to aerial and satellite imagery of the fires. And then, as mentioned, the shots at the beginning of the end, very simply, of Shaw setting those controlled burns in the brush, kind of bookend the film. Tell me a little bit more about we talked about some of the editorial decisions earlier, but what else went into balancing things between those intimate shots with Shaw to the maybe archival or the aerial and satellite imagery? And also, you said you're doing a lot of this on your own. How did you get some of those beautiful aerial shots for the film?
That balance that you mentioned was incredibly difficult, but was really important for us. So we wanted to give a sense of scale through the wide landscapes. Australia is such a huge and magnificent place, and I really wanted people to be able to feel that from what we were showing them, but also wanted to foster a really intimate connection between the audience and James, our lead character. So there were a couple of decisions we made. I think something that was a little bit controversial in the editing room was our decision to use interviews only as voiceovers. Our intention was to ensure that the emphasis and connection really remained with James, that the audience was grounded in his reality and experience. So that was one of the big decisions that we made. The archive montage that you mentioned was one of the hardest parts for me, trying to find my way through all that footage and piecing it together. Right. It was tough. During those fires in 2019, 2020, we were seeing imagery like that everywhere we looked in Australia. It was on our phones, it was in the newspaper, TV, social media. It engulfed you. You couldn't escape it at all. And I think I wanted to capture some of what that felt like all of it is real. All the footage that was sourced came from news outlets or supplied by rural fire services. Yeah, so it was really troubling, but that felt really important to telling the story of that time and that experience. We wanted to build a journey with the fire footage, really, a way of exploring our knowledge of fire, our relationship to it, to see it as something that's much more complex. You know, there are good fires and there are bad fires, and it's really important that we understand that in Australia, but then globally, these are issues that, you know, we're not alone in facing. So, yeah. And so with regard to the aerial photography, I mean, a lot of it is mine, most of it is. But then shots like Uluru, the budget was not that big, I'm afraid. Would love to have gone out there. But I'm very lucky where I have family down in Tasmania as well as up in Queensland. And those are really vastly different environments. So this was just me and my drone, supported by family and friends on the ground. Down in Tasmania, it's luscious, really ancient forest. I mean, everything is ancient in Australia, but up north, it's much more tropical. And so I had this really beautiful variety that I could access through the support of friends and family, which I'm very, very grateful for.
Excellent. And obviously you've talked a lot about kind of what your goals are with the film, but what do you hope specifically people get out of the film in terms of the importance of fire as part of the natural ecosystem? And you said there's good and bad fires, as well as learning more about kind of the difference between those good fires, the controlled cultural burns, and the bad fires, those wildfires that are out of control.
I think something that I've been asked a lot is why it's not immediately clear, how do you do cultural burning?
Yeah.
And that was a non-negotiable for me with this film. I didn't want to make a guide to cultural burning which could potentially be misappropriated or commercialized. So I think through that and through the film, my hope is that what it's doing and what we're doing is celebrating Indigenous knowledge and wisdom, emphasizing its value, and really inviting people to connect to their own country and to come together as a community. I think in the natural ecosystem, there's a real dichotomy as well, which I hope we captured. And that's another thing I think important to share. And we sort of touched on it earlier when we were talking about people's relationship to fire and water. The film celebrates the rich biodiversity, which is precisely what we stand to lose. Australia is recognised for its rich biodiversity globally, but it's also the world's worst nation for biodiversity loss and extinction. The koala, which is in the film, arguably the face of conservation in Australia, is facing extinction.
Right.
And globally, we need to really be aware of those things and not just accept one without the other.
Absolutely. Yeah, and I think it was towards the end of the film, you had a comment from one of the interviewees or something where, they said, if we can't band together to save the koalas, what chance do we have to save ourselves, kind of thing.
And I really hope that message came through because, these are little known messages. I think that, and I want people to feel really proud of their natural environments, their cultural history, and just know it a little bit more than we do. And so, yeah, I think curiosity is something we really wanted to give to people. And that's also potentially why we didn't answer all of the obvious questions for people. We wanted some introspective reflection.
Yeah, absolutely. Some opportunity for them to seek out more on their own and go beyond just this film.
Exactly.
Well, I want to congratulate you on being named as a Student Academy Award finalist this year. That being said, are there any festivals, any other screenings coming up where people can check out the film if they're interested in learning more?
Thank you so much. I mean, I can hardly capture what an honor it is to have a film like this, an Indigenous film, be recognized in this space and to know that people in the Academy recognize its value. That's something really important. Wonderfully, the film is doing really well in its festival run. So there are actually plenty of screenings coming up. If you're happy for me to, I have written a little list I can read off.
Go for it.
So in the US, we're heading to the Santa Fe International Film Fest and the Savannah Film Fest. In Mexico, the Wildlife Conservation Film Festival. In Australia, the Australian Independent Film Festival, which is in my hometown. And many of our contributors are able to go to that one as well, which is so exciting. We're going to the Canberra Short Film Festival, the Ealing Film Festival in London, and All Living Things in Delhi. So a jam-packed remainder of 2024 for us.
Definitely. You're going to be getting lots of frequent flyer miles, it sounds like.
I wish so much I was able to go to them, but this is a student production, and but I wish so much. It's just an honor to know that people around the world are being introduced to this story and to indigenous knowledge. So yeah,
absolutely. Now I have a couple of questions not specifically related to the film, but before I move on to those, is there anything else you want to touch on about Burnt Country?
Yeah, for sure. I think this film, at the intersection of Western and Indigenous science, which is where I was so inspired, I wanted to tell a story which really centered First Nations voices and wisdom, and that as a, I guess, climate or environment doc, that it centered messages of respect, community, and hope. The film is looking to a future where both our environmental and cultural heritage are protected and celebrated. So all I really hope is that some of that is what reaches our audience. This film has my whole entire heart in it.
It definitely shows. It's an absolutely beautiful film.
Wow, thank you so much.
Now, this might be the hardest question I ask, but if you had to pick your top 3 films of all time, what would they be?
Oh my gosh. Okay, first, I cannot pick favorites. Kids always like to ask me, like, what's your favorite dinosaur? I couldn't. Okay, but some titles that have really blown me away recently. All That Breathes, of course, by Sean Sen. Past Lives by Celine Song, incredible. And another really interesting sort of genre bender, We Are Still Here. And I couldn't possibly list all the directors. There's too many. It's a several-part series that bears witness to, I guess, ongoing issues of colonization and racism in cultures throughout Australia, New Zealand, and the South Pacific. And each story is told through a different medium or genre and lens. And it's an incredibly powerful series.
Excellent. Well, I actually haven't seen that one, so I'll have to check that out.
Oh, please do.
Now, if you could invite any 3 movie characters to your next dinner party, who would they be and why?
Oh my God. All the hard questions to the end, Jonathan.
Yeah, that's right.
Okay. The first thing that comes to mind is, this is a bit mad, 3 of Robin Williams' characters.
Okay. All right.
So imagine the chaos and insight from Mrs. Doubtfire, obviously, Mork, classic, and the Captain from Dead Poets.
That would be a lively dinner party, to say the least. Actually, the second person who's done that, I think I had one person who picked 3 different Tom Hanks characters at one point.
Oh, that's another really good.
Yeah, that's the thing. When you have such a iconic actor like those guys, it's hard to pick just one.
That's true. Oh, that's okay. Cool. I'm gonna have to go back through the episodes and see which characters they said.
Now, do you have any books that you could recommend that you've read recently? They could be fiction or nonfiction and don't have to be related to movies.
Okay, for sure. Oh, this is a really good and timely question. I've just finished How to Be an Antiracist, which is by Ibram Kendi. And it might be the most important book I've ever read. So I highly recommend that. And I think a staple in my field and my circles is Braiding Sweetgrass by Robin Wall Kimmerer. It's all about Indigenous wisdom and scientific knowledge and the reciprocal relationships between humans and nature.
Excellent. We'll put some links to those in the show notes so people can check them out.
Yes, please.
Yeah, and lastly, before we wrap things up, do you have other projects that you are working on or anything lined up going forward? And also, where can people follow you on social media to keep eyes on what you're working on?
Okay, for sure. So yeah, I'm working on a couple of things. I'm sure, I mean, every filmmaker is, right? But
Right.
I've just pitched my first feature doc, which is really exciting. And it's also about Indigenous knowledge and cultural burning, but tells a much more global story. So shooting for the stars, I'm hoping for an Australian, American, Canadian co-production.
Wonderful.
Fingers crossed. I'm also in the early stage of a doc animation, which is a really thrilling and baffling mix of genre and medium. So I'm really excited about that. I'm pretty terrible at keeping up with social media, but you can follow me on Instagram. I'm at Kirsty Grimm, like the authors, Grimm with 2 M's. And I'm trying to set up an account for Burnt Country as well. So that'll be burnt 2_country. I'm sure we can link them.
Absolutely. And we'll link to those in the show notes as well, so people can follow you and keep an eye on what you're working on.
Amazing.
Well, Kirsten, it's been wonderful to speak with you. Thank you so much for sharing the film and sharing the stories that went into making it. I really enjoyed it.
It's been my pleasure, Jonathan. Thank you so much.
Thank you again to my guest today, Kirsten Slemint. Her short film, Burnt Country, was selected as a finalist for the 2024 Student Academy Awards. The Oscar Project podcast is written and produced by me, Jonathan Eacherberg, with editing assistance from Joshua Eacherberg. Please be sure to come back for my next episode, where I will be speaking with Jamie O'Rourke, director of the short film Calf. Until then, I hope to see you at the movies.